Hello, everyone. It's now noon, and I think we'll get started. Even though I think there may be a few folks who join us and log on here over the next few minutes. So, welcome to the Bay Area Climate Change Council's third event of 2024. Today's topic is climate justice matters: strategies for equitable decarbonization. My name is Jessie Elders, and I manage the Bay Area Climate Change Council, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's roundtable conversation and asking your questions live at the end of the session. As we begin, we recognize that our work and the work of our member organizations takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Six Nations of the Grand River, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using, and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since time immemorial. A few just administrative tech tips before we begin. Please note that the webinar does have closed captioning available. You can choose to turn it on or off using the symbols at the bottom of your screen. We've strived to create an accessible space for everyone, so please let us know in the chat if there's anything else that we can do to support any other access needs. As you heard at the beginning, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on our website and in a post-event email. At the end of the discussion, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and so you can feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A at any time, and then we'll turn to them near the end of at the end of our discussion today. I also just wanted to highlight that BACC won't tolerate any form of disrespectful or inappropriate behavior in the Q&A, and so please keep the discussion respectful and inclusive and safe for everyone in the space. A little bit about the Bay Area Climate Change Council before we begin. We're the host of today's event, and we are a collective of organizations across Hamilton and Burlington committed to moving the needle on climate change. Our vision is for the Hamilton-Burlington Bay Area to be a thriving zero-carbon community by 2050. We develop and advocate for local climate solutions that will reduce carbon emissions from heating and cooling our buildings, from transportation, and from local industry. And we work to ensure that our region has access to sufficient low emissions energy to decarbonize. Today, we're really excited to explore foundational concepts of climate justice. And our goal was really to tailor the content for individuals and organizations somewhat like ours, working on decarbonization projects in the Hamilton-Burlington Bay Area. We're hoping to talk about how climate justice can be effectively integrated into local decarbonization efforts, working to ensure that our community's transition to a sustainable future is both equitable and inclusive. And it's my pleasure to have two experts in this space joining us today. And it's my pleasure to start by introducing Beatrice Ekoko, who is a project manager with the Office of Climate Change Initiatives at the City of Hamilton. Beatrice is the staff liaison for the city's Community Climate Change Advisory Committee, and she's excited to be leading the development of a co-designed climate justice framework that will be used to guide all municipal climate-related work. Prior to her work with the city, Beatrice gained over 15 years of experience in the not-for-profit world, supporting local community efforts towards a healthier, greener, and more equitable Hamilton. So welcome, Beatrice. We're thrilled to have you with us today. And the second panelist is Jacqueline Wilson. Jacqueline is a staff lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. Jacqueline joined CELA in 2015 and represents individuals, public interest community groups, and First Nations before tribunals and in trial and appellate courts. Her casework focuses on environmental justice relating to air, land, and water pollution and climate adaptation. Jacqueline's law reform work focuses on climate adaptation, energy justice, lead in drinking water, and land use planning. So thank you both for being here today. My hope, actually, Beatrice and Jacqueline, if you both feel free to unmute. My hope is that we can have a conversation today that, I sort of described it as podcast style, the goal of facilitating a bit of a conversation about this topic between the three of us. So, I'll moderate, but of course, feel free to just jump in at any point if you'd like to share a thought. I thought we could start by just developing a shared understanding of some foundational concepts, both for the three of us and for those listening in. And obviously, since the topic of our discussion today is climate justice, I thought we might start with that, trying to unpack that term a little bit to begin with. So the first question is really, what does climate justice mean? And maybe Beatrice, I can start with you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I do want to say that climate justice, I am learning. I'm in the throes of learning, and it's a concept that many of us are just kind of coming into and getting used to understanding, like what exactly that means. There's a YouTube video that I really enjoyed listening to, because it's children's voices and their perspectives of what climate justice is, and they're 7, 8-year-olds, and I love to put the link to this video in the chat, but they talk about like climate justice. Some of the things they say is climate justice is about people. Climate justice is understanding that climate change is already hurting people. Climate justice is understanding that those who did the least to cause climate change are already suffering the most. So, that understanding already of at that age, that climate justice is really about fairness. So when we're talking about climate justice, at its core, we're really asking, how can we tackle climate change and its impacts in that fair, equitable way that accounts for historic and ongoing injustices? So, if we're talking about just and fair inclusion in society, we want to, how can we make sure everyone's participating, people aren't being left behind, as well as the idea of addressing structural and institutional systems that result in these disparate vulnerabilities to harms and burdens, right? So for certain groups. Furthermore, equitable work that we're trying to do when we're talking about climate justice, we want to also correct those past harms that have prevented, that they've exacerbated harms and unintended consequences for future action. So recently I read this World Economic Forum report, which I found really interesting, because it talks about climate change doesn't impact everyone the same way. So climate, it will hit those countries who think globally. It's hitting the hardest hit countries are often those who have contributed the least to the problem. So North America and Europe are projected to lose, according to this report, they're projected to lose about 11% of median income due to climate change, while continents like Africa or South Asia may lose around even way higher, 22%. So there's an unequal burden as well. Those high income countries like Canada, responsible for over half of historic emissions, have much higher per capita carbon dioxide emissions than the low income countries. So again, although these high income nations they have that global emissions has fallen, yes, because of like technology and different green, really intense programs. There is still they still need to bear the significant responsibility for climate action to ensure that fair transition. So, I could talk a little bit more about that, but like even within countries, wealthier individuals contribute, according to this report, far more emissions, with the top 10% account for half of global emissions. So that's a massive amount, like within countries. So we have to really consider also inequalities exist in exposure to climate hazards and the ability to adapt. We've got these severe weather events are happening, and the struggle for so many globally those countries, whether it's the global south, or even within the global north countries like Canada and Hamilton, more specifically, we have our own, when it comes to who you are as a person, how can you respond? Whether it's your identity, your income level, there's a big difference in how you can respond to climate impacts. If you can cope, how you can adapt. So again, really, in short, when we're talking about climate justice, we've got to recognize that the negative impacts on those what we are calling frontline communities, it's not the same as maybe those who are more resourced and can respond. So that's in a bit of a nutshell. Maybe I'll pass it on to Jacqueline, or as you wish.
Yeah, that's great, Beatrice. And I would love to see that video. Kids cut to the chase in a way that the rest of us can't, so it's really cool. Um, I agree. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified sort of three pillars of equity, and I think it kind of captures what you were saying. So the first pillar is equity between countries, exactly what you're saying. Some countries are less responsible and they're going to be more impacted. It's unfair. The second pillar is between generations. So there's this real unfairness in the world that we're leaving to our kids and their kids and next generations. And the third is between people within a society. So people in different circumstances within our communities, income and other reasons. There's a tendency, I think, when you're tackling climate change to think about tackling it in terms of getting the most greenhouse gas reductions possible from any given action. And that's logical for a lot of reasons, because greenhouse gas emissions anywhere affect climate change everywhere. I mean, there is logic to that approach. And it's the dominant way of thinking about it, I think. So you reduce all greenhouse gas emissions, you fight climate change most effectively. But I think what the climate justice movement and the climate justice frame is trying to say is there's an issue with ignoring kind of these unfairnesses that have been identified that form the backdrop of what we're doing. There's a societal structure that we need to acknowledge and accept. It ignores the current and future impacts already of climate change, and the fact that, of course, it intersects with all these other unfairnesses in our communities, like poverty and food security and unaffordable and inadequate housing. So it's trying to, I think, center the impacts on people, and also recognize like the real circumstances in our communities that are already unfair.
That's helpful. I'm hearing there, maybe I have a tendency to have a bit of a categorical brain, and I've been working on it. But in that framing, I'm hearing kind of two themes emerging from what both of you have shared. The first is maybe that climate justice recognizes that climate change, it's a collective global crisis, but its effects aren't felt evenly, and we didn't all equally contribute to the problem. But it has a second component. It's not just recognition, there's also an action component, prioritizing the welfare and knowledge of those who are most affected by climate change, and maybe, Jacqueline, the idea of equity, different types of equity as a way that climate justice can be kind of operationalized or measured. You can enact it by thinking about equity. I don't know if that's a fair description, or another way you might describe it, but yeah, I'd be curious just to get your thoughts on the combination of recognition and action, or prioritization of those most affected.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the ways I was thinking about it in preparing for this webinar is I started to try to unpack the way that I speak about climate justice, which is useful because we all use so much jargon once and lingo, and your sort of shorthands for what you mean. And one of the things I was thinking about is I say disproportionate impacts a lot. I say, there's disproportionate impacts on certain communities, it's disproportionate impacts, but I think it's actually potentially two different concepts that I'm actually even talking about when I say that. One is that the magnitude of the climate impact is actually worse in some places versus others. So for heat, right, there are urban heat islands. There are certain communities within, Hamilton and Burlington and other areas that are hotter than others, right? It is actually worse in magnitude, the heat. And then when you add heat, it's going to be worse still, right, in those communities. So when you look at studies of like urban tree cover in our communities, it's lower income communities that have less urban tree cover. It means it's going to be hotter when there's more, the hotter weather means hotter neighborhoods. And I'll give another one, which I think is kind of interesting and less spoken about in terms of like actual magnitude of impact in low-income communities. There's a study that looked at flood risk in different communities, and I was looking at it in terms of concerns about wetland protections in Ontario now. And the study found that racialized people like seniors, lone parents households, Indigenous peoples and low-income residents were at a higher risk of flooding than other groups in Canada. And then Indigenous communities, as opposed to everyone else, there's a higher risk of flooding. Indigenous communities again. So it's sort of like magnitude is higher. So that's one disproportionate impact. The other one is a bit different because I think it's about saying that some people will be more impacted by the same exposure as other people. So when you're talking about heat, for instance, we talk about, there's certain people who are less able, or their bodies are less able to cope with heat. So it's people taking certain medications, for instance, right? So psychotropic medications are one that is often cited. It makes it difficult for an individual on those medications to regulate their body temperature. So the same magnitude of impact has a bigger health risk. It has a bigger impact on those people. Seniors, same thing. It's harder to regulate your body temperature as you get older. And so the same magnitude of heat is a bigger impact. I don't know if this is answering your question at all, Jessie, but it was interesting for me, I think, to think about, okay, like those are actually two different things. And that means that there needs to be kind of a climate justice response that addresses both.
Yeah. And I would actually add as well that there's another piece as far as like, and I think, Jessie, were you also considering the idea of like that distributive equity as far as a dimension of like climate justice, in the sense that when we're looking at the climate actions, how do they benefit? How are we ensuring that they benefit those historically marginalized groups that have been left out, or how are we ensuring that those, whatever we're doing through climate action, really it has that diminishes those burdens for those these groups of people that we've talked about, what I like to refer to as frontline communities. So we're talking about people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, women, gender diverse people, LGBTQ plus. So people with disabilities, as Jacqueline, you mentioned, right? So that distributive equity of any kind of action that we're, as municipalities do looking at, I'm talking from a municipal perspective, but again, ensuring that distributive equity piece is there, right, in the action.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to that, Beatrice, the initial video you chatted about, the kids' perspective, that really this comes back to a question of fairness, right? It's about identifying an unfairness and then trying to fix it, which I think is a really helpful, kids are great. It's a really helpful framing of the problem that is, I think, a little bit more relatable or accessible than some of the other words we might choose to use at different times.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really neat way to think about it. It's about the burden, it's about the impact, but it's also about like access to benefits. So, we'll get to it later in this webinar, but thinking about buildings and retrofits and things like that, right? It's both about, how you're being impacted by your current living situation and impacts of climate change, but also accessing benefit programs that we have and being able to participate in decarbonization.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've touched on it a little bit already, but maybe it would be helpful to dive into that, Jacqueline, in a little bit more detail. I know CELA works across the country, so we're inviting you to join us here in our corner of the Bay. But I wonder if you might be able to offer some examples of just what you've just mentioned. So what might be some local examples of disproportionate impact, but also disproportionate access to benefit in our region?
Yeah, so I was thinking about, this is a bit more specific to Hamilton as opposed to the rest of the community, but I was thinking about some ways that Hamilton is more prone to things like heat, to some of the worst impacts of climate change. So when I think about Hamilton, first of all, I think about the Code Red series. So the fact that there was already identified a long time ago, in 2010 actually, is when that came out, these really stark inequities in terms of life expectancy in Hamilton, and that frame, you know, it looks at like a lot of these factors like income and health and things like that. The other thing about Hamilton is that it's been identified. So, for instance, by the Intact Center on Climate Change, it's been identified as one of the places that's going to be most impacted by heat, the disproportionate impact. So, it was identified in that in a report that it's going to be the second most impacted by heat in Ontario. So, there's going to be more heat compared to other places as well. Um, and actually, there was a study, I think it was a little over 10 years ago, that also identified, this through the University of Toronto, but also identified Hamilton in particular as an area of concern for extreme heat events. Then there's a lot of other aspects of the Hamilton community. So there's a lot of renters in Hamilton. There's an aging population in Hamilton. There's a higher proportion of people living with health issues that can kind of interact poorly with heat. So there's higher a COPD, for instance. So you know, you have lung cancers, and COPD are higher in Hamilton, and that interacts with heat. It also interacts with air pollution that interacts with heat. So you have these sort of real kind of reasons that there's sort of particular need in Hamilton. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. And for those who aren't familiar, we'll make sure that we link in the email afterwards the Code Red series that Jacqueline mentioned. It was an investigative journalist actually who published a report initially in the Hamilton Spectator outlining the inequities within our community, and it was updated. I mean, relatively recently, I think 2019 or something like that. So we'll make sure to include the links to both of those in our post-event email if you haven't had the chance to read them yet. Beatrice, I want to create some space for you too. If you have any thoughts about some of the issues we might be facing here in Hamilton.
So yeah, as Jacqueline said, like heat is definitely, I mean, the country's heating up faster than, I think, twice as fast as most countries, especially the north of Canada. So heat is definitely a massive concern. We're also going to be looking at flooding. Flooding is we've had. I mean, Burlington's had. I know this past summer, Burlington got really flooded out, and Hamilton's always, you know, we've got those issues for sure. So again, we're looking at when it comes to you know, I've heard about all these health concerns. I know that the city has been proactively looking at through the public health services, looking at research, using research from the University of Laval's mapping vulnerability. So to really keep track of where are the vulnerability and exposure of like Hamiltonians to extreme heat. And so we use a lot of that to kind of inform the work that can address that. So the community heat, the heat strategy. So looking at that map to inform community-based focus sessions, the past summer the city definitely went out to make sure there was distribution of cool kits, tried some kind of actions where like extended hours at cooling centers and rec centers really, from a forestry perspective, we're looking at the coverage of this particular wards that maybe have a low tree canopy and close to industry. Industry is huge for air quality, so we're looking at a lot of that environmental injustices as well, and to make sure that in planting we're going to have a fair distribution of where trees will go, where coverage. So there is definitely a way to respond to a lot of what Jacqueline's just expressed. Those heat-related illnesses that are going to keep rising if we, as predicted, the global temperatures increase in Hamilton is unfortunately really not we're not no exception geographically. We are definitely going to be seeing a lot more of that extreme heat increases. So more tropical nights, more, like hotter weather inside at night where the temperature is not coming down. So a lot of concerns around that. Yeah, fortunately. And not to mention a whole slew of other things, food security, affordability, and I could just go on, right? Because everything really is going to get worse because of climate unless we do our utmost to prepare to adapt. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the perhaps maybe it's a selfish goal, but it was something that I'm hoping would be relevant for other organizations or individuals in the region who are thinking about climate change and climate action. The Bay Area Climate Change Council has a net zero goal, right? The goal is to see emissions reductions across the region. And we talk about embedding equity in our work, but we've tended to focus on emissions reductions. And one of the big topics of conversation around the back table is how can we better embed concepts of climate justice into decarbonization work or emissions reductions work. And I'd love to shift now maybe to a conversation about that challenge, because I think there's lots to unpack there, and hopefully we can pull out some strategies about how organizations like ours can better address some of the inequities you've just described through our decarbonization work. And Beatrice, I actually am curious to start with you, given the work that you've been doing in thinking about the City of Hamilton's climate justice framework.
Right.
Maybe you could share a little bit more about that framework and what it aims to do, and whether we might learn from that as we explore strategies in our own work.
For sure. Yeah. So, okay. There's a lot of work going on. We are working on, as Jessie said, a climate justice framework to guide climate-related municipal work. And the idea is to have this framework be co-designed, at least in part, to understand. And when I say co-design, it's going to be, we'll be engaging, or at least having trusted allies, local organizations who are our trusted allies, to do this engagement with us, like on our behalf. Because again, many organizations that serve frontline communities, such as I previously mentioned, they know their audience better than we do. So it makes to have that truly deep engagement, we're going to need to hear more than ever the voices of people who are directly being impacted, going to be impacted. And because there's such a diversity of people in Hamilton, different, you said your brain, Jessie, it categorizes a lot. So looking at the different needs, the very specific needs, to understand what are those needs, what are the aspirations, how can we uplift groups that have been traditionally excluded from the table, right? So whether it's bringing people into the process, or hearing about what will be specific challenges. So perhaps, there may be issues again and again. We hear about affordability. How can we, maybe mobility, transportation, whether it's again, health issues, like whatever, however much we can understand those values, what are those shared values specifically, to really guide the framework. And that framework, again, so that's an external piece. But internally, we're also looking at talking with staff. We've already been doing that groundwork. We started doing that work to begin to understand what are the challenges of embedding equity and justice. What are the what are the sticking points there? So the work has just really begun over the past year since I joined the city. It's really been about hearing, listening, relationship building, literature reviews. And so we have our first technical advisory meeting this Friday with internal staff, which is really exciting. And a lot of the members in that group come from the equity, inclusion, and diversity group, community engagement, public health, public works, in the Indigenous Relations Office. So there's a lot of great people on this team that are going to help us shape that part of the, of the framework. And I could go on, but I think that much of the work is going to be, eventually we'll have to be also looking at indicators, equity indicators. And again, those, I think one thing that's really important to think about when we're doing this really new work is to think about that it's a process, right? So it's something that's going to keep evolving, and it's going to keep, an equity indicator may work for a project on, say, something like an LRT project. There'll be different indicators on a something like a public work, like I'm just think like a road project or something, or public health. So the indicators will different, and I think that it's going to be really necessary to keep that community engaged and involvement. That's going to continue to always be a big piece, that process, right? For anything that we're putting forward. So and I do have other ideas, but I do want to make sure that Jackie gets a chance to talk. But we're talking a lot about, like, how do we really engage the people who are most impacted and keep that going, and find ways to really really, I want to really emphasize, any programs don't create more harm. And also we want to really look at other city plans that we have. So for instance, the Indigenous Relations Office has an urban Indigenous strategy. We have a health strategy. We have, like, there's so many different pieces that we want to really see how they align and make sure that we are working to support one another in that way, and just really provide the best opportunities we can for all Hamilton residents. So that's part of, in a nutshell, some of the work that's going on there. I also want to mention that the Climate Change Advisory Committee that was formed just recently, having our first meeting in April of 2024. We're actually having a meeting next week, and that's our 6th one. They have working groups, and one of them is climate justice. So it's very exciting to see that there is a massive concern, interest, and really desire to really put Hamilton to lead with equity. Really, that's really where we're at here, and I see that far reaching across the organization as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't think there are very many municipalities who are working on a climate justice framework.
You're right. I would say, yeah, I think as I said, it's North America. I would say we see great examples there. It's still very new. For as far as Canada, I would say Vancouver really is amazing. I've been looking at their climate justice charter and all the work that's coming up from that. They've got an UNDRIP plan, their implementation plan that came out this past June. So they have an equity strategy as well, framework, so that works in combination with, side by side with their climate justice charter. And incredible. Just recently, I was speaking to there's a new position there at the city there, and it's called let me get this right, Reconciliation and Equity Planner. So that came out of their climate justice charter. So that was a brand new position created, right, to really kind of, again, break those silos and really be that kind of liaison between community and their city. So incredible work that's going on over there. Of course, other places like San Diego, outside of Canada, Portland, LA, there's quite a few, California. So there's quite a few in that case. But equity, centering equity and climate justice is definitely new and emerging and exciting, and it's wonderful that we're getting into this way of leading. So I'm really excited by that.
And Jacqueline, I'm going to bring you in a second. I have one more question, Beatrice. As I think about it, one of the challenges I expect will be how to integrate it, because really you're talking about systemic change, right? To
Yes.
how we think about climate change and also how we think about combating it within, at a regional level, local level.
It's massive.
and embedding that into day-to-day decision making. So I don't know if you have any early thoughts or thoughts about how that integration actually starts to happen. You know, how
no,
you
for sure.
to really embedding that change in day-to-day making and policy.
I think it's going to be, I mean, we do have communications and engagement strategies are in development as well, because that, as you say, is a massive change, culture shift, even like so number one, even like the concept of climate change is not necessarily that clear to people, but I think fairness is something that people really understand. I'm thinking of a webinar I attended, Reclimate, and they talked about that fairness is a shared value across all Canadians really resonate with that. I wouldn't say all, but like it's resonating a lot, that the concept of fairness, which is great to hear, because then we'll facilitate that kind of understanding, like, you know, these changes are our climate, in a changing climate, consider that, paying attention to fairness and who's benefiting from projects, from climate action, who's not, who's been left behind. But I think if we can really kind of position it in that concept of like fair transition, just transition, as we're trying to move towards a low carbon community and society and world, I think that helps kind of people just get down to the basics. Like at the beginning, when I was saying with the kids, they understand this is about people. It's about not leaving people behind. It's about accountability, really, and creating a better space, better place for everybody. So I think in many ways, education is massive. We're going to keep that going. As far as training, we're going to, as far as our office goes, we'll be supporting staff in understanding where the challenges are, where it's through one-on-one interviews, surveying, sitting down, helping to figure out, okay, let's begin your project, whatever it is you're putting out there. Right from the get-go, you're going to have to consider equity, and not as an afterthought, right? It's less about using a lens. It's about really embedding it from the get-go. And that's going to take some time to shift that way of thinking for all of us, I think. So we have a lot of work to do. And the more voices, the better that can join this chorus.
Thanks so much, Beatrice. Jacqueline, I have a question for you about the distinction between mitigation and adaptation, but maybe before we go there, I'll just create some space. We've covered a lot about a climate justice framework, and I wanted to see if you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to add on that.
Sure. First of all, it is extremely exciting that this is happening in Hamilton, so that's great, and it's welcome. So that's fantastic news. When I think about these sort of issues, so one of the ways that I think we can try to embed it, or better capture climate justice kind of concepts, is the way that we measure success for any of these projects. So I'll give an example. It's not a total success, actually, so it's sort of just like a medium example. But at the Ontario Energy Board, there's a legal test called the TRC test. It's called the Total Resource Cost test. That's applied to approving design and delivery of energy efficiency programs. And it's basically just a cost benefit analysis. So it's comparing the cost to design and deliver those programs compared to the avoided cost of producing the same amount of energy. And it doesn't work well for low-income communities. And it's sort of ignoring the people that are actually impacted by it, because it's just looking at the cost, of avoided, energy production. So, it's about incorporating, and that test has been relaxed for low-income programs, actually. So that's the good news story. But it's about incorporating things like, well, there's health benefits to energy efficiency programs. Like, what does it actually mean to the people that you're serving with those programs? So there's comfort, but there's also like real safety that in your home that's improved with improved temperatures and improved, draftiness and that kind of thing. It also ignores, a straight cost benefit analysis type test. Ignores things like, money savings per month will matter more to a low-income household than it will to another household. So even a small, monthly saving it can be really important for people that are not in affordable housing and don't have affordable energy. They don't have energy justice. And it's also kind of, I would say, ignoring, there's this other kind of layer of unfairness in terms of energy efficiency, especially if you're a renter, because the landlord will control the efficiency of your place for the most part, but they may not benefit particularly from bringing about energy efficiency upgrades unless there's sort of mandatory standards that they need to meet. So there is this, problem with tenants who are often unable to pay it, but don't have really like the means to bring about any change and bring down their energy usage. They're actually paying more and sort of subsidizing these landlords that aren't taking steps to make their buildings efficient. So it's sort of ignoring all of that, right? Like if cost benefit analysis sort of ignores the context, it ignores what it means for people to save money, and it also, ignores the health benefits and things like that.
Yeah, that resonates with me because I think a lot about so the idea that measurement matters and what we measure matters. In the context of doing decarbonization work, often the measurement can be limited to just reducing carbon emissions, which is essential. I mean, obviously we agree. I think we all agree that's a key element of this battle and has benefits, but the reality is that has a lot of co-benefits and things that are important beyond emissions reductions. And one of the things we've been thinking about, is how to better measure and think about those other benefits. So when we're thinking about new housing development, we want to encourage it to be low carbon, but also maybe there are other metrics we should be thinking about, right, beyond just low carbon that should be tracked and measured. Things like some of what you've described, Jacqueline. The comfort of the home, the air quality in the home, the benefits that come with energy efficiency alongside efficient energy performance. And so I think we experience that as an organization working to decarbonize, working towards net zero. Part of what we're trying to do is expand that thinking around net zero so that it isn't just emissions reductions. And Beatrice, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I know you're directly involved in this work, but I know Hamilton's looking at carbon budget, for example, and I can imagine some of these issues come up there too, right? How to have an appropriately expansive view when thinking about measuring carbon.
I'm just thinking about Jacqueline, you said like about that that quantitative, right, data. So is it possible perhaps to do things like community feedback through like capturing their feedback through surveying or interviewing, or just like really, I know that sometimes surveying can be quite a bit of a burden on many people, but to really to understand that those perspectives a little bit better. Again, I always think of like with any what I'm learning a lot is that when you're asking for feedback for data, really from many frontline communities, like we're offering some kind of reciprocity, because it is a lot to keep being asked about feedback, to give feedback, and you got some what I understand, it can be an additional kind of like a disillusionment, almost like a burden. So really to understand, like when we are asking for those other indicators, or those other markers of success or not, or challenges, how can we best like get that information in a way that is that kind of nuanced information that you're talking about, Jackie? How do we do that in a way? So I think there definitely is a lot of challenges that way. And again, it is that commitment. I think it's really about a commitment to making those that equity be centered in our work. And definitely moving that way. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some trust building as well when we're trying to get the extra information that we need to actually be effective. I'm thinking of one even one program that we had that we have on the go now, Better Homes Hamilton program, right? And just so you know about that, with Burlington also has that. That was a program. So it's ongoing now. It's closed. The idea being that zero interest loans for up to 50 residents, Hamilton residents, to do home retrofits, so energy efficiency retrofits, whether it's like air sealing, insulation, heat pumps. And when we were discussing this, we were trying to think, okay, how can we make this as equitable as possible, right? And so we, again, even like in the selection process, to kind of look, we were made sure to look at those wards that had a lot of energy burdened homeowners, that because it's a homeowner program right now. Again, you can see even that the fact that it is for homeowners as opposed to maybe renters, there is, again, there was that challenge of how can we make programs, you know, effective in a way that they reach the most vulnerable people. But in this case, this is a homeowner property. Like you have to own a property to participate in this program. But again, we really try to see where are those homeowners that are definitely experiencing energy burden, and that's a massive problem here in Hamilton, right? So, you know, that intentionality is so important for us to really get in there and see. And I think it's actually project by project. It's going to need to be right from the beginning, as I was saying, to really look at how can we directly communicate with those people who are trying to reach, right? So yeah, it's a challenge for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the examples I point to that's quite interesting is California, and their cap and trade legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the one piece that I think is really valuable, like Jesse, maybe it's a lawyer thing, I don't know, but like I like to categorize things. So one thing that's great about it is they set mandatory requirements for how much money raised by the program has to be spent in low-income communities. So it's 25% in identified disadvantaged communities. They have a way that they identify that. An additional 5% of that income in low-income households outside, anywhere else in the state, and an additional 5% of like communities that are neighboring disadvantaged communities. So they have a number, right? So that's useful, right? It's not only aspirational. There's actually a target that is enforceable in some way. And then they also have this thing called low-income barrier impact studies, which are interesting, is sort of trying to get at what I think you're saying, Beatrice, is yes, of course, right? We need like people involved and consultation. It is, difficult to do that. It's easier to say than it is to do, like it's really complex because people are busy and they don't have time and they don't have money and they don't have, like interest and all that, they've got a lot of other things on their plate. So how to do that is a huge question. But also the things that you get back when you actually do it. So for instance, there's like some transit projects in California and they weren't being used very well, like they were trying to figure out why they weren't being used very well. And it's always so specific what you actually get back when you really talk to the people impacted. So it's like, yeah, but the bus stop is like 2 long blocks too far this way because everybody goes this way to drop their kids at school and then is continuing that way for work, and so they're not using it. Or there's nowhere to buy bus tickets, in the area to make it easy to actually use that bus stop. Or, it's things like that. Like it's really basically impossible for outsiders to understand, right? Like you need people to tell you what's wrong and why it isn't working because they'll get it.
For sure. And actually that reminds me of a group that in, I think it's Kingston, New York. They are called Mid-Hudson Energy Transition Group. And what they do is they literally will, I mean, they do such intense community engagement. They have almost daily in a low income neighborhood. There's mostly of Black people and Latino people. And their whole program is about electrification, but in the sense that they facilitate. They'll go in and do the audits themselves for free. I don't know, they're obviously getting government money. They can do they advocate for a pre-electrification fund, because they have found that so many times when residents get participate in these programs, there's barriers. For instance, a home might have black mold or structural issues, right? Before they can even engage in any of these energy retrofit heat pumps or that has to be dealt with first of all. But so they'll actually do the hand holding, and they're finding all kinds of really specific concerns, right? So and they'll connect to contractors. That's another problem. How people don't have time to figure out who to connect to, even if they are participating. There's so many. So I mean, I'm really impressed by this group, because not only are they doing this, they're also getting they're also looking at encouraging investment from the community. So if you're an investor and you want to, they're trying to facilitate ways to find different financing tools, and they're looking at ways to actually ensure that residents actually get a chance to, for instance, solar community. We've all heard of community solar projects, right? But like, how can you also have that kind of like side passive income like that? So finding ways to facilitate that transition, so that people are economically better as well. So I think that's an example of a group that's like, wow, like really working on the ground, working with municipalities, working with investors, and really, so it's a whole of society kind of movement. Like they're all kind of working together to do this work, and I'm really trying to follow that and learn from what they're doing. Right.
Some of what both of you have touched on addresses a question in the chat, but maybe not fully. So I'll just share it as well.
Okay.
It is really about this question of, where does class-based analysis fit in? And the question was, how can we integrate class-based analysis into determining whether or not a community can financially absorb the cost of a green transition? So I think that is, the example here was thinking about informed, targeted community supports for things like the electrification of transportation, home retrofits, and so on. So I think you've both touched on that a little bit, but I also just want to acknowledge the question and maybe give you a chance to address that maybe more directly. And then also just say, folks, that you can feel free to type in. We have a few minutes left, so I have a couple more here, but feel free to type in some questions if you'd like in the chat as well, based on the discussion we've had.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. In Ontario, there's actually a fairly long history of targeted low-income energy efficiency programs. And so one of the good things, it's a good thing, but it's also a good thing because we've learned a lot about how to design those better. And so there's a couple of things that I think are, translatable to any of this. It's one, it has to be full cost. So we do need to recognize when we talk about an affordability crisis, we talk about poverty levels, right? Like there is no money up front for some communities and some people to spend, even if you are over the long term going to get money back, it's simply not there. So they need to be full cost. We need to just recognize that. If you want to reach those communities, it's simply unfair to suggest like, oh, well, loan it back or you pay it back over time. It's like simply not there. The next is that there is a real trust issue in those communities for very good reason. There's a lot of reasons why they don't trust government programs. They don't trust government. They haven't been treated well in a lot of government programs. So building local trusted allies, like whether it's people working at food banks or working, social workers or in trusted spaces, and delivering programs through that is really important. And integrating programs with other things, so it's all well and good to have all these programs around, but it's a web, it's a mess to get yourself organized. Nobody can do it. Like I can't do it in terms of like, okay, income supports are over here and it's a different person, and health supports are over here and it's a different person, and emergency energy is one thing, and there's different things for energy efficiency, and there's different things for monthly bills, and having ways to integrate the programs so you don't have to apply so many times, you don't have to go to different people, you don't have to figure out where you're supposed to go, is a really critical way to make these programs actually work for real people.
Yeah, for sure. And just like you said, Jackie, and that example I gave earlier, that group recognizing that those specific challenges. Like, so, and the fact that people often, they need support in actually identifying opportunities. So there's that sometimes you don't even know about opportunities. So I'm thinking, you know, there may be that a Better Homes program, but maybe communities didn't hear about it. Like maybe the Black community hasn't heard about these programs, or as you say, like the lack of upfront money to participate. Because again, that program, you do have to do those. You have to finance. You have to find a way to, before you can get your loan, you have to have the money to do the retrofits, just like the Greener Homes Canada loan, right? The same applies. So yeah, those are a lot of considerations that we have to think about. And that's why, like, you know, there's some other programs, like I'm thinking of the LA, what's it called? Power and Water. They have a program where they're trying to make energy transition really equitable, and looking at how to, again, go into really have these champions go into the community, talk to people, really get the sense of what are the challenges are, so that they can also participate in this energy transition, and, you know, committed to like let me just look at my notes, because this is actually really something that I found very interesting. There's something called Powered by Equity, and they are looking at and it's the LA Department of Water and Power. So what they do is they have designed like a program where you can actually get in there and get some that collective funding. So you know, I can't go into too much detail about it, because I think it's pretty new, but that commitment and that level of, and I think you mentioned trust, and I think I did hear about this program that at first there was like, well, why should we trust you, right? Everything as a city of LA, why should we trust you, right? So they had to work on that trust first of all. So yeah, there's definitely trust building. It has to be continuous, and you have to really show, you really have to, as I'm thinking from a municipal side of things, you have to prove almost, because there's been so much wrong done, that now you have this massive challenge of creating that trust again. And that's why it's so important to have those partners. That collaboration, I think it's huge in this whole movement. We can't do it alone. Everybody has to participate in this, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we may have to start an actual podcast.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
There's enough to discuss in more than one episode. But I'm aware, Anna, I see Anna has a question in the chat. Just because of the time, I think, Anna, what we can do is get back to you afterwards by email and share some of the content of the answer with everyone in a post email summary, just so that everyone has the benefit of a response to Anna's question. And at this point, I have to move to a bit of a closing, unfortunately, because we're nearing 1, and I'm sure everyone has something to do afterwards. So we had a bit of you'll see our next slide, I think, will come up here. I was going to work on summarizing a kind of call to action for the Bay Area Climate Change Council emerging from our discussion. I think some of the things that I'm taking away from this conversation for our work is obviously really thinking about organizing our projects with equity at the center, like you say, Beatrice, embedding that from the beginning of a decarbonization project, and not somewhere along the line. It really has to be a core focus. Centering the voices of those who are most impacted by climate change was something we talked about a lot, and also expanding measurement beyond just greenhouse gas emissions reductions to think more holistically about what we're doing when we're working to achieve net zero or decarbonizing. Yeah. Maybe I'll give you each 1 second if there's something you'd like us to add to our call to action, and otherwise, of course, I'll invite anyone to reach out to us to discuss further afterwards. So maybe Beatrice, if you'd like me to add.
I would like to add that collaboration, yes, is I really stress that, but I would also like to add that because we are all settlers on Indigenous lands, I would like to see more incorporation of Indigenous people's perspectives and knowledge. That would be very fit in, because climate justice is Indigenous justice too. So I really want to make sure to add that piece. And access, access. I think Jackie mentioned about access. So having that access to information and participation, that's going to be very important as well. As we keep rolling out projects and decarbonizing projects, and of course that remembering that it's an intersectionality. There's adaptation, that there is no real, to me, adaptation, mitigation are literally the same, have the same weight, because we're going to reduce emissions, but we also need to adapt. So equity kind of ties the two together, climate justice. So yeah, that's my last two cents here. Thank you.
Thanks so
Yeah,
much.
that's great. I think it's about centering people, centering why we're bothering in the first place to care about climate change. And for the most part, I mean, we care about it for nature and for, the environment kind of writ large, but it's also about how it impacts people in our communities. And, climate resilience is about, like tying those concepts of mitigation and adaptation together.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. And Beatrice, we're so grateful for your insights and for the discussion today. It's been really a pleasure to have the chance to share this conversation with you, and I hope it's the start of many to come. So please feel free to connect with us if you haven't already. Those of you who are watching, feel free to reach out if you have additional thoughts or questions or would like to have a conversation afterwards. We're happy to do that. And Beatrice and Jacqueline, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We're grateful.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
so much for
us.
having me.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank
And
you.
have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.